Welcome to the Highland Wonders podcast, where we share stories and knowledge from experts about the charismatic species and diverse ecosystems of the Okanagan Highlands of north central Washington. My name is Jen Weddle, and I am a co-director of Okanagan Highlands Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to protecting the beautiful Okanagan Highlands, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Okanagan First Nations in British Columbia, and the Okanagan, Lakes, and Colville bands who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Hey Ari, want to hear a joke?
Sure.
Okay. How do you tell a black bear apart from a grizzly bear?
I don't know.
Well, let's say you're out in the woods and you see a bear. If you climb a tree and the bear follows you up, it's a black bear. And if the bear knocks the tree down, it's a grizzly bear.
Ha ha ha!
In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Bill Gaines, Executive Director of the Washington Conservation Science Institute, who has been conducting wildlife research for over 30 years. Many of those years have involved studying bears, both grizzlies and black bears, in the North Cascades, where an expansive area of remote wilderness has historically been the home of both black bears and inland or interior grizzly bears. Bears are intriguing creatures. Studying bears is a challenging task, and we are fortunate to have this opportunity to hear about Bill's adventures studying the iconic wildlife that inhabits the wildest, most remote areas of the northwestern United States. His enthusiasm for his research, for the ecosystems and for the wildlife, especially bears, of the North Cascades is obvious and honestly a little bit contagious. And the depth of his knowledge is more than a little impressive. So you are in for a real treat with this episode. Enjoy!
Blessed unrest.
Thanks for joining us on the Highland Wonders podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. Bill Gaines, and I presently work for a group called the Conservation Science Institute. I'm a wildlife biologist by training. When I was 10 or 12 years old, I recall my grandmother going, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a wildlife biologist." And her response, which wasn't that encouraging, was, "Do they actually pay people to do that stuff?" But I stuck with it and, went through school and college, and eventually I became a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service. So I worked out of the Methow Ranger District for a long time. And then I transferred down to Wenatchee area and worked there for a long time. So 27 years as a federal biologist. That's what got me involved initially with bears and the grizzly bear recovery effort and all that stuff. And then about 10 years ago, I left the Forest Service and started my own research institute. And there's just a small group of us that work together, and we do a lot of different kinds of wildlife and environmental studies as part of our group. So yeah, a little bit of my background. A lot of our research is focused around climate change. We just finished a big study looking at the effects of all the fires on Canada lynx up in the Okanagan country. There's been, as you know, a lot of fires in the last 10, 15 years, and had significant impacts on their habitat. And also work on a number of bear projects over the years. I got involved with the grizzly bear project in the late 80s. It was part of a study where we were just beginning to talk about grizzly bears in the North Cascades. And the study was about how much habitat is there? Is it good habitat? And what's the status of grizzly bears? What do we know about bears? So we worked on that for about 5 years. And my job was to try to create this pretty colored map of the habitat across 6.5 million acres of the ecosystem. Not an easy job. It took us a long time. But the result of that was that we found we had some really, really good bear habitat and some evidence that we still had a few grizzly bears. That information was what led the Fish and Wildlife Service they reviewed our study and they made a decision that we should pursue recovery of grizzly bears in the North Cascades. That was in the early 90s. And then they went on to develop recovery plan. I then got involved in a really large black bear study. It was actually what I did my graduate work on, where we had radio collared black bears all around the North Cascades. I was working with some folks from the Department of Wildlife, and it was an amazing time. I had an excuse to go to some amazing places in the Cascades and chase these bears around with radio collars. So that was really exciting. And then more recently, effort to try to use some newer technologies and see if we can get an assessment for, do we have any grizzly bears left in the Cascades, and just kind of get an assessment of their status.
What are the new technologies?
So the remote cameras is one of the technologies, and it's not that it's so new, it's just that it's evolved to where, when I first started doing remote cameras, I think a remote camera weighed about 30 pounds because you had to power it with a golf cart battery. And so you couldn't really carry those too far. Now they're small and they're high resolution, and you can carry a bunch of them into some remote places. So we were using that. And then we also using what we call hair snares, which is basically a barbed wire, a corral. You make a circle out of it around some trees, and you hang it on the trees just about knee high. And in the middle of it, you put this really nasty stuff that we call goo. We lovingly called it goo. And it was a way of bringing bears into that site, and they would crawl either under or over that barbed wire and leave a hair. And we usually left them out for about a month. We hiked these things all over into the wilderness and into the backcountry and all kind of crazy places. Anyway, we would take that hair and collect it, and then we can send that to a lab, and they will determine whether it's grizzly bear or black bear and give us some information about the genetics of the black bears as well. We were kind of doing a dual study of black bears and grizzly bears on that. So it was about a 5-year effort. I think we put out something like 700 and some odd hair snares and cameras. We backed them into some crazy places, got genetic information from close to 750 black bears, and never got a single grizzly bear hit on all that effort. So it shed some light that our grizzly bears aren't doing well here in the Cascades. If there are any, there aren't very many. And it also led to some of the discussions around the need to, look into restoration efforts for grizzly bears if we're going to keep them around here in the Cascades. It just kind of shed some light that even though they seemed to be relatively healthy historic population here, the current population is very, 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 very low. I do have to tell the story about the goo. The goo is, we usually carried it in like liter, bottles, like an Nalgene bottle. And you start making goo in the fall for your field season the next summer. And it's a combination of road-killed deer and spawned out salmon carcasses all poured into these big 50-gallon drums. And every so often you have to go out and stir it over the winter, and it kind of cooks and bakes. And by the time spring rolls around, it's turned from a solid to this terribly stinky, smelly liquid that we pour into these Nalgenes, and then we're carrying it, on our backs along with all the other sample gear into these crazy places. And you don't want to spill goo on you. I remember the story of one guy who's, as we were creating a site, spilled some goo on his pant leg, and he just got his knife out and cut his pant leg off and left it on the pile. It smelled so bad. So you're really careful about the goo, but the goo is actually, we didn't invent it. They used the hair snare technique and an attractant like goo in a lot of bear studies, a lot of research studies, like in Glacier National Park, where they have a lot of grizzly bears. It's a really effective technique at sampling bears, both grizzly bears and black bears. So that's why we thought we'd give it a try here in the Cascades. But yeah, it took a little while to get used to the goo. When I first started using it, it was really hard to sit down and eat lunch after pouring your goo. But by the time we were done, we handled it pretty well. So you kind of get used to it. But
So is that something that bears in particular love?
So we got some wolves that came and checked out our sites. We got Canada lynx at our site. We got cougars, but it seemed that the bears were the only one. We actually got pictures of this one picture we got of this sow with 2 cubs and with a black bear, and she came in, and those cubs rolled around in that goo, and by the time they left, you could just see their fur stuck to their sides where that goo. I mean, they were like just walking stink bombs. And we didn't really see some of the other carnivores quite as enthused by the goo as the bears were. But yeah, it seems to work quite well for bears. So yeah.
Wow, that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, in a gross way. Yeah. So some of the challenges are, trying to find a bear in 6.5 million acres, much of it really remote and really wild and really challenging to get to. I love going into those wild countries because they're spectacular, but they're also physically really demanding, especially when you're carrying 3 liters of goo and 100 feet of barbed wire and cameras and all that stuff. It's physically a very demanding project, but also extremely rewarding. So I would say it was over the course of the study, we had a lot of crew members come and go, but it was just fascinating to bring young biologists in and share that experience with them, get them out in these wild places and let them, experience what it's like to be out there in some really remote locations and the physical challenges of it as well. So, what attracted me to the wildlife field was, one, a curiosity of animals, and secondly, the desire to be outdoors and be in some of these spectacular places. I have been really fortunate in my career to see some pretty spectacular places around the world in studying these carnivores. So, yeah.
Okay, well, should we launch into a little bit more about bear biology?
Yeah.
The first kind of general questions are grizzly bears and brown bears the same?
Yeah, so they're the same species, but they're really different. What makes them different is where they live. The brown bears are really, we refer to the coastal bears that live in Alaska or in some parts of British Columbia, where their whole life is around salmon coming up the stream. And they have an amazing food resource, just phenomenal food resource. And they spend their lives living off salmon, and they grow big because of such a rich and pretty easily available food source. They can consume a lot of calories in a day as they're putting on fat for the winter. And so, they're considerably larger than the grizzly bear that we have here in the inland West. Those bears are often over 1,000 pounds in size, where the big interior grizzly bear that we would experience here in the Cascades, 500-600 pounds, would be a big male, probably half that size to maybe 3/4 that size, a female. So considerably smaller than what we would call a brown bear. So we kind of refer to the inland bear as the grizzly bear and the coastal bear as the brown bear. Yeah, but very different behaviors, very different food habits. Our bears, grizzly bears inland, typically live oftentimes their diet is 85% vegetation. They're opportunistic in when they can get meat, and it can include some fish, it can include insects, it can include deer and elk that they might get. They're not as efficient as a predator as, say, a cougar or a wolf. They're much more generalized in their diet. They have teeth more like ours, where the back molars are flat for grinding vegetation, because they are adapted to eat both vegetation and meat. But a large part of their diet comes from vegetation. In our part of the world, in the Cascades, probably a considerable food source is going to be huckleberries and other shrub-producing fruits. And we have, I think, 7 different species of huckleberries in the Cascades that grow from, pretty low elevation to high elevation. So a pretty rich food source. And it's been found that those are key food sources for grizzly bears inland, those huckleberry fields.
So do you think that historically salmon were a bigger part of the inland grizzly diet?
I think to some degree, maybe, more over on the west side of the ecosystem. Certainly they still do, even black bears still do feed on salmon in the Skagit River. I live close to the Wenatchee River, and they feed here in the upper parts of the Wenatchee. So there still are food resources. In the mid-1800s, early explorers came through and sent some grizzly bear hides off to the Smithsonian. And some researchers got some hair off that recently, and you can analyze the diet from the hair and in a real general way. And they found some salmon that were in the diet of grizzly bears historically. So I think it was, but probably, and in the case of most grizzly bear populations inland, it's a fairly small part of their diet. There's other food sources that play a bigger role. Historically, the inland grizzly bear occurred throughout the West, all the way down actually into central Mexico. So a long ways down south and all the way east as far as the Great Plains. there's stories of bears feeding on buffalo historically out in the Great Plains. A result of predator control effort, historical trapping. It's a whole host of reasons why their range shrunk considerably to just a handful of places, mostly in the Rockies and then in the Cascades, both Cascades of Canada and the Cascades of Washington. The strongest grizzly bear populations are in and around Glacier National Park and in and around Yellowstone National Park. Those populations are doing quite well as a result of many, many years of effort to recover them. There's other smaller populations, one here one in Washington, the very northeast part of Washington in the Selkirk Mountains. That area extends into Idaho and it also extends into Canada. So there's a shared international population there that's pretty small. It's only, I think on the US side, probably 30 or 40 bears. It's fairly small. There's another pretty small population in the Yak Mountains in northwest Montana. Again, a shared population with Canadian neighbors, and I think the U.S. side's probably more like 50 bears, but still fairly small. So there's these sort of remnant populations of bears from an era when there were, many, many more throughout the West.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how to identify bears when we see them? Like, what's going on with bear fur color? Are black bears really black?
I can touch on the color a little bit because from all these remote cameras we put out, we got thousands and thousands of pictures of bears all across, the North Cascades. And what we found was that on the east side of the Cascades, so kind of in your part of the world, 70% of the bears that we got, black bears, were not black. They were blonde, strawberry blonde, black mixed blonde. It was we got some crazy colors on these bears. Some of them you're kind of looking like, wow, where did that bear? We had the one bear, this young bear we called the Rad Dude bear, because it had like this, it was black underneath and it just had like this blonde stripe of really long hair going right down its back. And it was just really unique color. And I had to do a double take when I got the photos back. What are you? And then if you go over on the west side and we look at those bears, just the opposite. 3/4 of the bears we get are black, and then we get a few that are lighter in color. And it probably is a local adaptation to our environment. If you think about, our ponderosa pine forest, there's a lot of brown, in the background, as opposed to the deep, dark woods of the west side, where that black color probably camouflages them better and they blend in better. So it's probably a bit of a unique. The adaptations to their local environment is probably what causes that coloration. But what that means is that you can't rely on color alone to distinguish a grizzly bear from a black bear. And even grizzly bears have a lot of variability in color, from very, very blonde to really dark, almost black color, really, really rich brown. So it can be very difficult to distinguish them as well. So color, we have to be really careful about using color as an indicator of what kind of bear you're looking at. We usually rely on things like the shape of the head. Black bears don't have a lot of facial hair around their face, and grizzly bears do. It makes their face look much rounder. Their head looks bigger in relation to their ears. So grizzly bear ears look kind of small, whereas black bear ears look more like a mule-like, a little larger in relation to the head. We look for that hump, because it's a muscle mass that grizzly bears are much more adept at digging. Those large claws are actually not for grabbing prey. They're actually for digging out plants and roots and tubers and digging into the soil to get food. And as a result of all that digging, they basically exercise that muscle across their shoulders and they become very powerful that way. And it develops that muscle and it develops that muscle mass. So it gives them a pretty prominent hump. Black bear claws are shorter and more hooked. They're really adept at climbing trees, but they're not as adept at digging. Grizzly bear claws are longer, so they're almost like having a shovel on each end of their paw. So as a result, black bears often don't develop that muscle mass across the shoulder. And so the hump is a good indicator. You have to be a little bit careful with that one, because I've seen the situation where maybe a black bear is standing on a log and its shoulder blades are pushed back, and it can look like a hump. So you kind of got to watch that hump. When we get photos, we're looking, is that a hump? And does it stick around or does it go away? Because if they move and you can see that hump go away, then you're usually looking at a black bear. We also look at the claw. The claws on a grizzly bear, because they dig so much, the very outer edge of that claw is dark, but it gets worn back and it exposes a much lighter color. And you can actually see the claws. You don't have to get real close. You can see the claws from a pretty fair distance. So we'll look for that. Whereas black bears, again, short, pretty dark claws and not as much digging. So you can get some physical characteristics that you can distinguish, from visual. The other thing that we look at is really good is the track. There is a way you can tell on the front foot of a grizzly bear or a black bear. There's 5 toes on bears, kind of, like our fingers, and only they're the opposite of us, where our thumb is on the inside, their smallest toe is on the outside. So it's just the opposite. What you look for is whether all 5 toes are pretty well aligned, which they are on a grizzly bear, but on a black bear, that smallest toe is actually out of a line with the other 4 bigger toes. And there's a way you can see it. It's pretty obvious if you have a good track. You'll see that small toe is kind of closer into the body of the bear. And it's a really good way, if you have a good set of tracks, to distinguish a grizzly bear and a black bear. We've had a few situations in the Cascades where we've used tracks to distinguish the bear species. So the other challenge there is if the bear's going up a slope, you skew the track. If the bear slips on the mud, it skews the track. So you got to have a pretty solid imprint. I often look along streams because a lot of times that's where you can get a good place where you can get a nice clear print. Yeah.
So do the camera traps work pretty well?
They do. We often use the cameras in combination with the hair snares. That way we have 2 ways of figuring out, especially if we think we have a grizzly bear, we really want to be sure that's what we got, right? Because you don't want to misidentify that. And so that's why we kind of doubled up as often as we could on using those technologies.
Talking about the different colors and on different sides of the Cascades made me wonder about their range, like the range of an individual or family.
Yeah. So bears they're one of the what we refer to as the wide-ranging carnivores. They cover a lot of ground. You think of them like wolves and cougars and all those other big wide-ranging species. So, and a female grizzly bear and her cub, a typical home range is 100 to 150 square miles. So that's the amount of territory they cover over the course of a year. And a male often has 2 or 3 times that size of a home range. So of all the wildlife species I've studied, they have one of the bigger space requirements. And they require that to just find the foods that they need over the course of the year. A lot of times they den up pretty high in the high country because the snow provides an insulation for them, and they move down into the lower country below the snow line when they come out of the den in the springtime. And then they kind of follow the development of the green up of the plants as the snow recedes and they move up into the high elevation. That's kind of a typical movement they do throughout the year. And to do that, requires a lot of space. They have to hunt and forage for food. They're big-bodied animals, so they got to consume some calories. One of the things that makes it challenging from a conservation perspective is having enough large and contiguous wild country to support a population when animals need so much space. And that's kind of what makes the Cascades and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the Glacier National Park and that area unique. We have, between national park and wilderness areas, in the North Cascades, 6.5 million acres. And then you add the national forest to that. It makes a big block of public land. And that's why it's even possible to think about having grizzly bears here, is because you need that big block of public land. It has some places that are really remote, because grizzly bears in general like to avoid people. They're pretty shy about people. And so remoteness is an important component of their habitat. So they cover a lot of ground, and oftentimes a major portion of that home range is comprised of places that are away from people. Probably in the springtime when they come down the lower country is when they're most likely to interact with people. So that space requirement means you have to have a lot of area, and there's just not a lot of area in the lower 48 states to even consider that. We have a handful of places. So that's what makes the Cascades somewhat unique.
Do you have a sense of what the population was in the North Cascades historically?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we don't have really a number, but we have good records that we've dug through to try to kind of understand, number one, were they here and were they seem to be fairly robust numbers, and then what happened, and so Hudson Bay was the major fur trapping company in the Cascades area. They kind of had a monopoly actually, and in around the 1820s to 1840s, they were worried about other fur companies coming in and competing with them. So they kind of did this, let's liquidate the assets while that's a good time. And they hired a lot of trappers. This is the same time when a lot of the beaver were trapped out in the North Cascades. A lot of the fur-bearing animals were trapped. There were 4 forts that served the North Cascades. One was around Vancouver, British Columbia. One was around Okanagan in the Okanagan Valley on the British Columbia side. One was down more towards Yakima on the southern side of the Cascades, and then one was over towards Tacoma. So the trappers would come out of the mountains and into those fur trading companies, and then those furs would get shipped around from there. And they kept good records of what came into those forts. So we went through those records. And in that 20-year era, there were almost 4,000 grizzly bear hides that were recorded through those forts. Now, not all of those came from what we call our North Cascades. A lot of those could have come from other areas in Washington or Idaho or British Columbia. But we know that many did come from the Cascades. And it was probably a pretty significant hit to the bear population because, like I mentioned, they require a lot of space. They never occur at really high densities because they space themselves out, right? So they're really susceptible to overtrapping and overhunting. That era of trapping was followed up by around the 1900s into the 1940s and 50s. We hired government trappers. There's a story about Peterson, who was a government trapper that worked up in the Mazama area, and he in I think it was 1923. He chased this grizzly bear around all summer long. There's a lot of sheep and cattle grazing going on, and he was trying to keep the bear away from there. And he finally managed to get that bear in the I think it was late summer of 1923. And there's a picture that I have of him with his trophy. And I have a number of pictures of some of those government trappers with their bears all into about the 1950s, about where that ends. I got some pictures from the Aniat Valley down here closer to Wenatchee. So kind of scattered around. I don't think at that point there were a whole lot of grizzly bears left. I think that significant impact from the earlier trapping, but the government trappers were good at what they did, and they got a few more. The last bear that was shot legally in the North Cascades was not too far from Washington Pass in what is now the North Cascades Park. In 1967, there's a photograph of the fellow who got that bear in a local newspaper posing with his trophy. And then it was just a few years later, I think in 1970, when the bears were officially protected by the Endangered Species Act. So yeah, there's a history, a pretty well-documented history of grizzly bears in the North Cascades, and pretty wide-ranging throughout the North Cascades as well. So we know they were there, and at least based on what we know about bears now, there's really good habitat for them. There are just not very many bears left.
Do black bears and grizzly bears compete for resources and territory?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, they do. Grizzly bears and black bears have a really different evolutionary history. Grizzly bears evolved in the more open kind of tundra type habitat. So they often occupy those higher elevation alpine areas, those alpine meadows where, as you think about late summer, fall, when the berries are on, if it's a good berry season, there's a pretty highly concentrated food resource there, and they're going to spend a lot of time in those berry fields. So that's a really important time. Black bears, conversely, evolved in a more forested environment. They're more comfortable foraging in the forest, but they will also end up in those high elevation meadows. They're going to follow the food resources as well. Black bears protect their young by sending their cubs up a tree. I've had a few encounters of black bears over the years, and it's amazing. Mom will give a little grunt and that cub is, up the tree, and they scurry quickly. Grizzly bears, because they evolved in that more open country, they didn't have the opportunity to send their cub up a tree. So their defense is to defend their young, to protect their young that way. So it's just evolved some different mechanisms in terms of how they protect their young. Those food resources are really important for grizzly bears and black bears in the fall. They go through what we term hypophagia, which is a fancy term for eat a lot. And in the fall, they're trying to really concentrate their food intake because they're trying to put fat on for the winter time. One thing we've learned is there's more protein in these plants that they're eating than we originally thought. They're using that in the carbohydrates, but berries oftentimes concentrated sugar, right? I often am just baffled by the idea that a little berry converts to a big bear. It's a little bit of a quirk of nature, quite honestly, that big animal has evolved, living on that kind of a diet. And, I do want to, grizzly bears are opportunistic carnivores. So they will take, for example, in Yellowstone, they hunt down, elk calves. It's just that when you look at the course of the year, it's significant in terms of the quality of the food, but it's not significant in terms of the overall amount of diet in their diet. So, digging up bees nests and ant hills and that kind of stuff is certainly can be a part of their diet. And black bears do the same thing. So,
yeah. Is that kind of an early season food, the insects? Or
I would say it's more across, evenly across the seasons, and they're probably pretty opportunistic, quite honestly. Oh, there's a log I'm going to tear apart. But there's that evolutionary history that, that kind of provides some separation in where they hang out. Black bears more evolved to that forest environment. Grizzly bears more evolved to the open environment. But, I think probably the time where they're going to interact the most is going to be in the fall, when those berry fields, those high elevation berry fields, is where the food resources are concentrated. That's probably where they're gonna end up. Neither black bears or grizzly bears are real territorial in the sense of a cougar, where they go around and mark their territory and boot everybody out. But they're going to defend their personal space, and so a black bear is going to be a little nervous around a grizzly bear. There's no question about that. And there have been documented cases where grizzly bears have killed black bears, in certain cases. I don't think it has a significant impact on black bear populations, but I could see a grizzly bear taking over a meadow and that black bear going somewhere else. I have a little theory that I think that black bears in the North Cascades kind of think they're grizzly bears because there's not very many grizzly bears here to remind them that they're not. And by that, I mean that I see a lot of black bears hanging out in those high elevation meadows during this late summer, during the berry season. And my guess is they'd probably be, some of those would be somewhat displaced in certain cases by grizzly bears. If grizzly bears, we just don't have that many, and we're not going to have that many for a very long time to have much of an impact. So black bears are going to kind of remain the king of those meadows for a while yet. But yeah, typically between mid-October and mid-November, they go into the den, and they're in there till mid-March to mid-April. So they're considerable time in the den, and they got to have a pretty significant fat resource to get through that time. So they go through this period in the fall where they're just consuming a lot of calories, and that's where they are really focused on those berry fields. If the berry fields aren't there, then sometimes they'll move back down into low elevations along the rivers where there's still some moisture and green vegetation for them to take on. They're really interested in getting food. 30,000+ calories in a day, and they've been documented in some of these bears that are concentrated on this food. So that's a lot of berries to consume, but they're really trying to put on that weight so they can get through the winter. Bears will hibernate for different periods depending on where they live. Down farther south, the hibernation period is shorter because the snow-free period is longer, but it's an adaptation to get through times when the food resources aren't there. So the plants dry up, the berries dry up, the food resources aren't there. It's time to hibernate. So grizzly bears will usually move up into high elevation country, and they'll often dig a den and hibernate in that high elevation country, and that snow provides that layer of insulation for them. Yeah. So good grizzly bear habitat has good foods, and it's really remote. They that's when they really like to be away from people, because they don't want to be disturbed from their berry patch. They got their head down and they're thinking about food.
So they don't necessarily reuse a den from year to year. It sounds like
They usually don't. I think probably because they've been in there all winter for sanitary reasons. They don't do it. So they'll dig a den. A lot of times they try to find a place that has good soil, because they'll try to dig the den kind of down and up, because they want that cold air to drain out of there. They'll sometimes line it with grasses and stuff so they can make a little nest. And then mom goes in the den if she's pregnant and she's in good shape. In other words, she has a lot of fat. Then she'll have her cubs in the den, usually February sometime. And the cubs will stay in the den with her, oftentimes twins, that's most common. And they'll, feed on mom bear milk, which is really, really rich in fat. It's like something like 40% fat. It's just really rich in fat. And they're growing in that den, teeny little cubs, until they come out in the springtime. And usually the males come out first, and then the females will come out with their cubs a little later. So interesting stuff that happens in the den. So these bears aren't moving for, sometimes 5-6 months at a time. If we stayed immobile for that time, our bones would break down, but somehow they're able to tolerate that. So it suggests that there might be something we might learn from them about, osteoporosis and breakdown of our bones. There's some, research trying to understand that better. They're living off of a high-fat diet for half of the year. How do they tolerate that high cholesterol? Another really good question. Once they go into the den, they don't go to the bathroom anymore. So these toxic substances are building up in their blood, and somehow they're able to tolerate that. And there's human implications there for people with, kidney issues. So there's interesting physiology there that we don't fully understand, but it may have some implications for human health and human medicine as well. Yeah.
So the black bear population, would you say, how is that in the North Cascades?
It seemed to be good. We got a lot of bears on our cameras. We probably got a black bear or more, one or more, on 70+% of the hair snares and cameras we put out. I know the Department of Wildlife is trying to revise and come up with better population estimates of black bears. I've heard estimates of 20,000 plus bears across the state, not just in the North Cascades, but across the state. I don't know how much reliability to have in that number, just because I think they're trying to come up with better estimates. I will say that based on the research that I was involved with, the home ranges of black bears on the east side are quite a bit larger than the home ranges on the west side, just because the food resources here are more dispersed. So they got to cover more ground. We're just drier. Whereas the wet, moist side, I think, really good habitat for black bears, really concentrated food source, a lot more moisture, a lot more plant resources, that kind of thing. So the number of black bears that is going to differ depending on the kind of habitat they live in. So.
Is there any other factors that have affected grizzly bear populations in the North Cascades beyond the trappers?
Yeah, there's probably some other things to think about there. One is grazing. A lot of the predator control efforts by the government trappers were to protect sheep and cattle that were grazing on the national forest lands. In addition to that, wildlife biologists thought it was a good idea to take out wolves and bears and other predators just to protect and enhance deer and elk populations. That was the thought at the time. I think we've learned now that bears and wolves and deer and elk have coexisted for a very long time, and there's some important ecological reasons why they need to be together. Bears and wolves are important in terms of sort of maintaining the health of those elk and deer populations as well. So there's some new, better insights into predator-prey relationships than what we had back then. But another factor that is important, and human caused mortality is the major factor for mortality of grizzly bears across the globe. And certainly in the other places in lower 48 where we have healthy grizzly bear populations. And that had to do with how people act in bear country. making sure we keep our food and our garbage stored away so bears don't get habituated. We have some real problems already in the Cascades with black bears. I live in a town that has real problems every summer with black bears, and it's just about, separating bears from garbage. There are situations where grizzly bears get in trouble, and sometimes they're moved to a new place, but other times you have to remove that bear because they've gotten so used to people that it's a real safety hazard. And the deal with grizzly bears is because those cubs spend 3 or 4 years with mom, and mom teaches them everything they need to know how to make a living when they go off on their own. If she has taught them to become used to people, then they have learned that as well. And oftentimes you have to take out mom and the cubs, or you have to figure out a place for them to live. That's, you can try that, or you have to put them in a rehab facility. But it is a major challenge, to educate people about how to. It's not a huge change in behavior, but it is a change in behavior when you're living in grizzly bear country and recreating and hunting and all those things we like to do in bear country. There's just some things that we need to alter in our behavior. A lot of those things we ought to be doing with black bears, but we just don't seem to take black bears as seriously as we do grizzly bears. But we probably ought to. And so yeah. So that is a major factor in other populations, is the human factor. Another factor can be bears get hit on highways, bears get hit by trains. There's sort of some human access route factors that also can play into, grizzly bears and bears in general, and in terms of sources of potential things that can kill them, mortality sources.
You mentioned that the grizzly bears are endangered federally. Is that the case for Washington, and what about Canada?
Yeah, so the status of bears in Washington is they're federally threatened as well, and they actually even looked into whether they ought to be endangered, which is another higher level. And the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that they probably should be listed as endangered, but because of all the other listing priorities they had at the time, they didn't change the status. So it's technically threatened but warranted for endangered status, just because we have so few bears here. In British Columbia, it depends on where you're at. The bears that are immediately adjacent to the North Cascades extend into British Columbia, and it's actually a co-managed population as well. But they're just not their population immediately adjacent to the border is their most endangered population in British Columbia. And the very same reasons we have here is, that history of trapping. There just aren't very many bears. There's better evidence that they still have a handful of bears there. There's more recent documented sightings, but not very many. Mm-hmm. So they're looking at, ways to restore their population as well. If you go farther north into British Columbia, more into the coastal range or more in the central British Columbia, you start getting into healthier grizzly bear populations then. So they're not as threatened, if you will, as the one right adjacent to us in the border.
So Canada is interested in possibly reintroducing.
Yeah, so they've looked at a very similar, restoration proposal on their side of the border as well.
As far as the roles of grizzly bears and their ecosystems, what do you think has been the impact of their absence? And also then to follow up, what might be the impact if they were to return to the North Cascades?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the most difficult questions to answer, I'll be honest with you. And there are two reasons for that. One is that our knowledge and our research it's difficult research to do. It's very difficult because in order to understand how bears interact with other parts of the ecosystem, you have to not only be studying the bear, but you have to be researching the different parts of the ecosystem at the same time. And probably one of our best sort of experiments was in Yellowstone, where we had bears and we had them, the role they played in that ecosystem for a long time. And then all of a sudden we added another carnivore and it altered that role, and it made us better understand sort of the context of what grizzly bears were doing there in the absence of wolves, and then what the two predators do in combination. And I think that's really, really important. We do know that bears play a role in maintaining the health of those high elevation meadows. That digging, and I've seen bear digs that look like a rototiller went through this, and just churned the soil up for a pretty extensive area. And so it creates seedbed for plants. It also discourages the establishment of conifer species which tend to encroach on those meadows. So there's a role there in terms of meadow health. In addition, they're consuming plant seeds that then through their, they disperse when they deposit their little piles here and there. So there's a seed dispersal component of that as well. Those are ecosystems effects that are pretty subtle. They're you have to really dig in and observe to understand those effects. And I think that's one of the differences between a grizzly bear role in an ecosystem and something like a wolf is effects of a wolf are more obvious and the grizzly bear effects are more subtle. And it makes it more challenging to research to understand those subtle effects. So we have to explain the role with a bit of, to be a little not very arrogant. We have to really, really acknowledge there's a lot we don't know yet about their role in these ecosystems. One of the things that we did discover in Yellowstone was that in the absence of wolves, so just with bears alone, the predator-prey situation there, bears were not enough of a predation event. They didn't exert enough pressure to really have a lot of maintenance over elk populations. And what was going on there was elk populations were growing in Yellowstone. They were really, really focusing a lot of their foraging in riparian areas. They were grazing down a lot of the vegetation along those streams. That was having an impact on other species like birds, beavers, and things that rely on that vegetation along those streams. And again, grizzly bears were there, but they weren't there in enough numbers to really dramatically alter, either the number or how elk use those landscapes. When wolves came in and their numbers began to build, and grizzly bear numbers were increasing at that time too, the combination of that predation, a lot of times bears and wolves hunt down, they forage and they hunt along those riparian areas. So it wasn't so much that they were reducing the elk numbers, they were just changing how elk were using that landscape. And they were giving that riparian vegetation some time to recover. And as a result of that, the willows and a lot of that riparian shrubbery came back. The birds that are associated and nest in that came back. And there was sort of this effect that went kind of what we call cascaded through different parts of that ecosystem. So we know that the role that these upper level carnivores play is important. It's been absent from the Cascades for a long time. And by that, I mean both bears and wolves. Black bears can play that role to some degree, but again, they don't have the same, digging capacity. They're not built for it as much as so there's a different role they play. Again, if the changes we're going to see, if it's just grizzly bears alone, are going to be subtle. But as bears and wolves recover, we could see more considerable changes. But again, it's going to be subtle for a while, just because it's a long proposition before we have enough grizzly bears, in this ecosystem to have much of an impact. Just to build on that is I'm often asked why we should think about recovering grizzly bears. And one of those reasons is this ecological role they play. And there's other reasons too. I think that acknowledging our ignorance around how does an ecosystem function when it has its full complement of animals and predators in particular. There's just not very many places across the globe. There's places in Alaska, certainly, but there's not very many places where we have that full complement of carnivores and other species that we can understand what those roles are. We can study those roles, and we can understand what a fully functioning ecosystem really looks like. There's very few places where we have that opportunity. In the Cascades, we have wolverines are making a pretty good comeback. It's pretty exciting. In my career, I've gone from hardly ever seeing them to seeing them on our camera, which is pretty exciting. Wolves are making a comeback. A lot of the wolves that came down into the Cascades came down from coastal parts of Canada. And so there was kind of a natural recovery of wolves in the Cascades. And that's pretty exciting. We got some wolves on our cameras. Canada lynx is another, carnivore, and we know we have them out there. We get them on our cameras. I'm nervous about them because of all the fires we've had, but they're out there. So there's many of the pieces are still there, but the grizzly bear is a piece that probably of all the carnivores that we've researched, just the one that we're going to have to give some helping hand, honestly, or they're going to disappear off our landscape. So that's one of the reasons we did the search to try to understand whether we had any left, and that's another reason why the proposal is there for this restoration work. So being the geeky scientist, when people ask me, why should we have bears here? I'm like, well, I'd like to study an ecosystem where we have that full complement and understand how that ecosystem functions. There's other reasons, there's social reasons why people want to consider grizzly bears here, but just from the scientific perspective, there's that just having a few of these sort of example areas to study and research and understand is important.
Do you have any reservations about the prospect of introducing new grizzlies?
Yes, I do. I think one of the things that's challenging, and we've been trying to do education and outreach, like what we're doing here about bears, but when human communities live without grizzly bears for generations and generations, like we have here, we lose sort of that knowledge of how to behave and how to interact with grizzly bears. And it takes a while to educate people and sort of reestablish that knowledge. It's certainly, those were growing pains that folks went through in the other ecosystems where bears are recovering, and I think we're going to experience the same thing here. So my angst is more around just the ability to work with people and get the factual information out there around what it means to live with bears, as opposed to the emotional, hypersensitive information. There's a lot of emotion around this issue, and just, I'm not, it's not my job to convince people to love grizzly bears, but it's my job to help people understand the biology and the reality of what it means to live with bears, and then they can make their own decisions, around how they feel about grizzly bear recovery. But so there's a pretty large task ahead of us if we go down this road of restoring grizzly bears, of bringing people's knowledge up to speed and just working with them and understanding the concerns they have and the issues they have, and that sort of social aspect of this. Honestly, the wildlife biology part is the easy part. It's working with people and understanding their issues and being open to their issues and truly working with them to help them get them the best information we can for their own decision making around this. That's the part that concerns me the most, is that more social component of this. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that we didn't talk about or that I didn't ask that you would like to share?
I do want to share a story, and it's what piqued my quest to figure out whether we still have bears here in the Cascades. And this goes back to the early 90s. And I was on a mountaineering trip, and I was carrying ridiculously heavy packs, into this remote part of the Glacier Peak Wilderness, this valley called the Pique Valley, which, when I think of a valley that is classic bear habitat, I think of that valley. It is some of the best grizzly bear habitat I've seen anywhere in the lower 48. And the reason it's so good is it's remote. It's got a bunch of big avalanche chutes, and those big avalanche chutes create a lot of meadows, and it creates great foraging habitat for bears. It's just really rich in bear foods, and it's remote. So I was heading in there with my climbing partner to go climb this peak, and our goal was to get off the trail and get up into this high basin and camp for the night, and then climb these peaks the next day. And we weren't too far off of the trail, and as we were kind of getting to the subalpine, so we're kind of starting to run out of trees, there was this log across the path that I wanted to go up. And as I approached that log, I was a little bit ahead of my climbing partner. And as I approached that log, I got to see over that log, and there was a bear face on the other side of that log looking right at me. I could just see its kind of head and shoulders. And I'm like, I stopped and I put my hand up, to tell my partner to stop. And we just kind of froze. And I looked over that log, and we were like looking right at each other, and probably 30 or 40 feet away. And I looked at this bear, and it was blonde colored. It had a really round looking face. So I'm the geeky biologist. So I'm going through my list of physical characteristics, right? Check, check, check. And its ears looked real small in relation to this face. It wasn't a really giant bear. It was probably, if it was a grizzly bear, I would guess it would be 2 or 3 years old, not fully adult. From the angle I was looking at it, it looked like behind its head I could see a hump, and I'm like, whoa, this? And because of the log, I couldn't see its feet, so I could not see its claws. And as soon as I twitched, that bear spun, was gone. I did what you're not supposed to do. I ran towards the bear because I was trying to get another look at it. And I really wanted to see this bear, to see if it was a grizzly bear. And I did not get another look at it. There was a stream close by, and I walked up and down that stream trying to find some tracks. But out of all the bears, I've seen hundreds and hundreds of bears in North Cascades, and I've never not been able to tell what a bear was. I can always say it with a black bear. To this day, I cannot tell you whether I may have encountered one of the few remaining grizzly bears. I don't know, but it sure made me curious as to whether there were any more out there in these remote valleys. So yeah, that's one of my favorite bear stories.
That's a good one. That sparked like 30 years of investigations.
Exactly. And I'm still going out. Yeah. One last thing, if people want to know more about the grizzly bear recovery, there is a Friends of the North Cascades Grizzly Bear website that folks can go to and understand more about that.
Okay. Well, that was really fun.
That was great. Good. Thank you for great questions. And I appreciate the opportunity.
We're all what it is, 'cause we're living with blessed unrest.
This podcast is produced by Okanagan Highlands Alliance. OHA is based in Tonasket, a town in the heart of the Okanagan Valley of north central Washington. We are inspired by the beauty and diversity of the landscape that surrounds us, from the aspen and conifer forests to the highland lakes to the tumbling creeks that descend to the wide, glacier-carved Okanagan River Valley. We engage in environmental advocacy, habitat restoration, and educational activities in our efforts to protect local ecosystems for future generations. Acknowledging that grizzly bear restoration is a controversial issue, OHA is interested in sharing facts and information about inland grizzly bears, their life history, their habitats and ecosystems. Building awareness and understanding is our goal. And, as always, we encourage everyone to participate in the public process by providing input to the decision makers when the opportunity arises. Check the episode notes for links to find more information about the process and timeline of the grizzly bear restoration proposal in the North Cascades. Thanks to Bill Gaines for sharing his experiences and understanding of the unique ecosystems of the North Cascades and our region's charismatic, iconic wildlife species. Listening to Bill talk reminds us that science is an adventure in more ways than one. So follow your curiosity and find some time to explore your place, wherever you may be. To learn more about OHA or to become a member, please visit our website, okanaganhighlands.org. Our theme song, Blessed Unrest, is written and performed by Tyler Graves and Andy Kingham. You can support the artists by finding and downloading the full song from your favorite music platform.